"Relax," Richard Cole said, flicking his wrist as the red wine tilted dangerously close to the edge of the crystal glass. "It's not like you can afford to care." The glass tipped just enough, a thin ribbon of Cabernet slipping over the rim and landing across Marcus Reed's hand, dark against his skin, warm for a second before cooling under the restaurant's conditioned air, and then everything stopped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in that quiet way expensive places freeze when something uncomfortable enters the room. Silverware paused midair, a low murmur cut short. A pianist in the corner, missing half a note before recovering like nothing happened. And Marcus didn't move, not right away. His fingers still wrapped around the edge of the tray, his posture straight, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady in a way that didn't match the moment. Because this wasn't new. Not the tone, not the assumption, not the casual dismissal wrapped in a tailored suit and a $7,000 watch that caught the chandelier light like it had something to prove. And Richard leaned back in his chair, satisfied, not angry, not even particularly invested, just bored. Enough to make someone else smaller for entertainment. While the two guests at his table exchanged quick glances, the kind people give when they want to pretend they didn't see anything, but absolutely did, and the manager across the room had already started moving, fast but controlled, the way someone does when they know exactly which side of power they need to stand on. But Marcus still didn't move, the wine trailing slowly along the line of his wrist, slipping past an old scar that caught it. For just a second before letting it fall. And if you were close enough you might have noticed that scar didn't belong to a waiter. Not really. It belonged to heat, to long hours, to something built rather than served. But no one was that close. Not yet. And Marcus finally lifted a folded linen from his arm. Not rushed, not reactive, just precise. Pressing it lightly against his skin as if this moment deserved the same care as any other. And when he looked up, he didn't look at the stain. He looked at Richard, not with defiance, not with submission, but with something quieter, something harder to name, like he was measuring more than the situation, like he was placing it somewhere, storing it. And Richard noticed that, just for a second, a flicker in his expression, because he was used to reactions, apologies, discomfort, anything that confirmed the hierarchy he lived by. But this stillness didn't fit, and it irritated him in a way he couldn't explain. So he exhaled sharply and waved his hand like clearing smoke. "Get someone else," he said, already turning his attention back to the menu, already done with the moment, already assuming it was over, but behind Marcus, past the polished wood and the soft lighting, there was a door slightly ajar, and inside that narrow space, just out of sight, a pen rested on top of a document waiting for a signature that would change everything before the night was over. Marcus stepped back from the table with the same measured pace he used for every guest, the kind that did not invite attention and yet never felt small, his shoes silent against the polished oak floor as the low hum of conversation slowly returned behind him, like a room deciding it was safe to breathe again. And he did not look back, not at Richard, not at the table, not even at the faint outline of the manager who had stopped halfway across the dining room, uncertain now whether intervention was still necessary, because Marcus had already moved on, at least on the surface, his tray balanced, his posture unchanged, his expression neutral in a way that had taken years to master, the kind of neutrality that was not emptiness but control. And as he passed beneath the warm glow of the hanging lights, the reflection of the wine stain still faintly visible against his skin, he turned slightly toward the service corridor, pushing through the swinging door with a soft, familiar pressure. And the atmosphere shifted instantly, the quiet elegance of the dining room giving way to the rhythmic pulse of the kitchen, stainless steel catching brighter light, the sound of pans, low voices calling orders, the steady hiss of heat rising from the line. And Marcus paused there for just a fraction of a second, long enough for his shoulders to lower by an inch, long enough for his breath to settle into something deeper, more grounded, before he set the tray down on the prep counter with careful precision, aligning it as if it mattered, as if every small action still held weight. And across the room, an older cook glanced up, noticing the faint red on Marcus's hand, not asking, not needing to, just offering a brief nod that carried more understanding than words ever could. And Marcus returned it just as subtly before reaching for a clean towel, wiping the last trace of wine from his wrist, the fabric dragging lightly across the old scar again. And this time he did not rush it, did not hide it, just let the motion finish completely before folding the towel once, twice, and placing it aside. And then, without announcement, without hesitation, he turned toward that slightly open office door at the back of the corridor, the one most staff passed without a second glance, because it belonged to management, to paperwork, to decisions made far above their pay grade. But Marcus walked toward it like it had always been his destination, his steps steady, unhurried, each one quiet but deliberate. And inside, the room was smaller than the dining area suggested. A single desk, a lamp casting a focused pool of light, a stack of documents arranged neatly at the center, and that pen still resting exactly where it had been left, waiting, patient, as if it understood timing better than most people did. And Marcus stepped inside, closing the door behind him just enough to soften the noise from the kitchen, not fully shut, just enough to create a boundary. And for a moment he stood there, looking at the papers, not scanning, not rereading, because he already knew every line, every clause, every number down to the last decimal. And then he reached forward, picked up the pen, and held it between his fingers, not gripping, not hesitating, just feeling its weight, as if confirming something internal rather than external. And somewhere beyond that door, back in the dining room, Richard laughed again, louder this time, confident, certain, completely unaware that the balance of the entire room, of the entire building, was already shifting in a direction he could not see, not yet. And Marcus lowered the pen to the page, his hand steady, his expression unchanged, and began to sign his name. The pen moved smoothly across the paper, ink settling into fibers that had already been reviewed, negotiated, and finalized long before this moment. And Marcus did not rush it, each letter of his name forming with quiet precision, as if the act itself deserved respect, as if this was not a reaction to anything that had just happened outside, but the continuation of something set in motion years ago. And when he finished, he lifted the pen slightly, not dropping it, not letting it clatter, just placing it back exactly where it had been, aligned with the edge of the document. And for a brief second, he looked down at the signature, not with pride, not with hesitation, but with a calm recognition, like confirming a decision that had already been made long before tonight. And then a soft knock broke the stillness, 2 light taps against the partially closed door, followed by the cautious voice of the restaurant manager, Daniel Brooks, who pushed the door open just enough to step inside, his expression tight, uncertain, eyes flicking from Marcus to the documents and back again, as if trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same person standing in front of him. "Marcus," he began, lowering his voice instinctively. "We have a situation out there." And Marcus turned slightly, his posture unchanged, his hands now resting loosely at his sides. "Table 12. Daniel continued, not needing to say the name, not needing to describe the tone, because it was already understood. "He is asking for you to be replaced." And for a moment the words hung there, expected, almost routine, but something underneath them felt different now, thinner somehow, like authority losing weight before anyone noticed. And Marcus nodded once, not sharply, not submissively, just acknowledging the information as data rather than judgment. "I understand," he said, his voice even, steady, carrying none of the tension that Daniel clearly felt. And Daniel hesitated, his eyes drifting again to the paper on the desk, to the signature that was still drying under the warm light of the lamp. And something in his expression shifted, confusion mixing with realization. "Is that finalized?" he asked quietly, almost carefully, as if the answer might change how he was supposed to stand, how he was supposed to speak. And Marcus followed his gaze briefly before returning it to Daniel. "Yes," he replied, simple, direct, and the word landed differently than anything else that had been said tonight. Heavier, more permanent, and Daniel straightened slightly without realizing it, his shoulders adjusting, his stance recalibrating in small, almost invisible ways. Because titles had not been announced yet, nothing had been declared, but something had already changed, and both of them could feel it, even if the rest of the building could not yet. And from beyond the door, the sound of laughter rose again, Richard's voice cutting through the room with that same easy confidence, that same assumption of control, ordering, dismissing, filling space like it belonged to him. And Marcus listened for just a second, not reacting, not tightening, just hearing it clearly, as if placing it in context. And then he stepped forward, closing the distance to the desk once more, gathering the documents into a neat stack, aligning the edges with a precise tap against the wood, before handing them to Daniel. "Please make sure these are filed with the attorney first thing in the morning," he said, calm, measured, and Daniel took them automatically, his fingers tightening slightly around the pages. "Of course," he replied, almost reflexively, and then Marcus reached for a clean jacket hanging on the back of the chair. Not a uniform, not the standard issue worn on the floor, but something darker, more structured, the fabric heavier, the fit exact, and he slipped it on with a smooth motion, adjusting the cuff just once, not for appearance, but for alignment. And when he turned back toward the door, his expression had not changed, still calm, still composed, but there was a subtle difference now, not in his face, but in the space around him, like the room itself had begun to recognize him differently. And Daniel stepped aside without being asked, the movement instinctive, respectful in a way he had not shown before, and Marcus walked past him, pushing the door open again, the sound of the kitchen rising back into full clarity, the rhythm, the heat, the motion, and beyond that, the dining room, where nothing yet had caught up to what had already been decided, where Richard Cole still sat at table 12, unaware that the balance of the entire evening had already shifted quietly, completely, and permanently. The door swung open with a soft push, and the dining room unfolded in front of Marcus again, unchanged on the surface yet subtly different in weight, like the air had shifted in a way only he could feel, the warm lighting still casting golden reflections across polished glass, the low hum of conversation steady, controlled, curated, and at the center of it, Richard Cole sat exactly where he had been, leaning back in his chair with the same effortless authority, one arm draped over the backrest, the other lifting a glass as he spoke, his voice carrying just enough to command attention without needing to rise. And as Marcus stepped forward, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with that same deliberate calm, a few heads turned again, not because of him specifically, but because movement in a room like this always drew the eye. And yet there was something about the way he walked now, something subtle but unmistakable, that made those glances linger a fraction longer, as if people were sensing a shift they could not yet name. And Marcus approached the table from the same angle as before, the same measured steps, the same straight posture. But this time he did not carry a tray, his hands free, his shoulders squared in a way that did not serve, but simply existed. And Richard noticed him almost immediately, his expression tightening just slightly, irritation flickering across his face like a brief shadow. "I thought I asked for someone else," he said without looking up fully, his tone casual but edged, the kind of voice that assumed compliance before it was even confirmed. And Marcus stopped at the table, not too close, not distant, just within that precise space where presence mattered. And for a moment he did not respond, not out of hesitation, but because silence itself had a role to play, a weight that words could not carry. And the pause stretched just long enough to disrupt the rhythm of the table, just long enough for one of Richard's guests to shift in their seat, for the clink of glass against wood to sound slightly louder than it should have. And then Marcus spoke, his voice even, clear, not raised, not softened, just steady. "Good evening, Mr. Cole," he said. And the name landed differently this time, not as recognition, but as placement, and Richard's eyes lifted fully now, meeting Marcus's gaze directly, searching for something, irritation, defiance, apology, anything that fit the pattern he understood, but finding none of it, only that same calm, that same controlled presence, and it unsettled him in a way he did not expect. So he leaned forward slightly, setting his glass down with a faint, deliberate tap. "Let me make this simple," he said, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the effort behind it. "I do not want you at this table." And there it was again, the assertion, the boundary drawn with confidence. But this time the room did not respond the same way. The energy did not immediately bend around his words, because Marcus did not move, did not step back, did not signal compliance. He simply stood there, listening, as if the statement required acknowledgment but not obedience. And the difference was small, almost invisible, but it was enough to shift the balance, enough to make the moment linger instead of resolve. And somewhere behind them, Daniel had stepped into the dining room, documents no longer in his hands, his posture different now, more attentive, more aware, watching not as a manager managing a situation, but as someone witnessing something unfold that he could not interrupt. And Marcus finally spoke again, his tone unchanged, calm, grounded. "I understand your request," he said, and for a split second, it sounded like agreement, like the expected response. But then he continued, the words precise, measured. "However, I will be the one overseeing your experience this evening." And the sentence settled into the space between them with quiet finality, not loud, not confrontational, just undeniable. And Richard blinked once. The smallest break in composure, his expression tightening as his mind tried to place what had just been said, not the words themselves, but the authority behind them, because something about it did not fit, did not align with the role he had assigned moments ago, and the room felt it too, that subtle shift, that almost imperceptible change in gravity, as if the center of control had moved without announcement. And Marcus remained still, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, waiting, not for permission, but for the moment to fully reveal itself. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and controlled, and for a brief second the entire table seemed to pause in place, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. And Richard leaned back slowly, his fingers tapping once against the side of his glass, a habit that usually meant he was about to take control of a situation. But this time the rhythm did not come as easily, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he studied Marcus again, searching for the familiar signals that told him how to proceed: submission, discomfort, apology, anything that confirmed the order he expected. But there was nothing there, only that same steady presence, and it irritated him in a way he did not like. So he let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You are persistent," he said, tilting his head just enough to show mild amusement, but the edge underneath was sharper now, more deliberate. "Let me be clearer. I decide who serves me in a place like this." And he gestured lightly around the room, not looking at it, because he did not need to. It was already his in his mind, already under his influence, or at least that was what he had always believed. And one of his guests shifted again, eyes flicking between the two men, sensing that something had moved beyond a simple exchange, that the balance was not as predictable as it should be. And Marcus remained still, absorbing the words without reacting to their tone, his posture unchanged, his hands relaxed at his sides. And when he spoke, it was not to challenge, not to correct, but to clarify. "That used to be true," he said, his voice quiet enough that it required attention, but steady enough that it carried across the table without strain. And Richard's expression tightened, just slightly, because the phrasing did not fit. It implied something had shifted, something he had not approved. And that alone was enough to trigger resistance. "Used to be?" Richard repeated, leaning forward now, his gaze sharpening. The question less about understanding and more about reasserting control. And Marcus held his gaze without hesitation, not confrontational, just present. "Yes," he said simply, and the simplicity of it made the moment heavier, not lighter, because there was no performance, no escalation, just certainty. And across the room, Daniel had taken another step forward, stopping near the edge of the dining area, his attention fixed on the table, his expression no longer uncertain but focused, as if waiting for a moment he knew was coming but could not interrupt. And a quiet shift rippled outward, subtle but real, a few nearby tables lowering their voices, a server pausing mid-step before continuing more carefully, the atmosphere tightening just enough to be felt but not explained. And Richard noticed that too, the slight change in the room's behavior, the way attention was no longer centered on him alone, and it annoyed him more than anything Marcus had said. So he straightened in his chair, adjusting his cuff with deliberate precision, reclaiming his posture. "I do not know what you think is happening here," he said, his tone cooler now, more controlled. "But you are still an employee in this room." And the word employee landed with intention, meant to define, to limit, to place Marcus back into a role that made sense. And for a moment the room seemed to wait for Marcus to respond, to either accept or resist, to fall back into the expected pattern. But he did neither. He simply inclined his head once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. And then, With the same calm precision he had carried all night, he reached toward the edge of the table, not touching anything, just resting his hand lightly against the wood as if grounding the moment. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, did not harden. It remained exactly the same, steady, measured, undeniable. Not anymore, he said. And this time the silence that followed was different, deeper, because something in the room understood before it was explained. Something had already changed, and it was only now beginning to surface. The words did not rise above the table. They did not need to. They settled into the space like weight added to a scale that had already begun to tip. And for a moment no one moved. Not Richard, not his guests, not even the servers passing behind them. Because something in the air had shifted beyond language, beyond roles, and Marcus did not fill that silence. He let it exist, let it stretch. Because some truths required space to be understood, not explained, and Richard's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of his glass before releasing it again. A small, controlled motion, the kind that suggested restraint rather than uncertainty. But his eyes gave him away, just for a fraction of a second, a flicker of calculation, of reassessment, because the pattern had broken and he was trying to rebuild it in real time. That is not how this works, he said finally, his tone lower now, more measured, as if choosing precision. Over volume might restore order, and he leaned forward just enough to reclaim presence. You do not get to redefine your position because of a conversation. And the word conversation carried a quiet dismissal, an attempt to shrink what had just happened back into something manageable. But Marcus did not respond immediately. He shifted his gaze slightly, not away, but outward, toward the room itself, as if acknowledging something larger than the exchange at the table, and the restaurant seemed to respond in subtle ways. The light reflecting differently across glassware, the distant clink of utensils softening, a server pausing near the bar before continuing with quieter steps, and Marcus drew a slow breath, not visible, not dramatic, just enough to ground the moment before speaking again. You are right, he said, and the agreement landed unexpectedly, causing Richard's posture to ease by a fraction, anticipating compliance, anticipating the return to a familiar structure. But Marcus continued without changing tone. It is not because of a conversation. And the sentence extended the silence again, not breaking it, deepening it, and Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, the tension returning, sharper now, because the control he was used to was slipping in increments too small to interrupt, but too consistent to ignore. And behind Marcus, Daniel stepped closer, not into the conversation, not interrupting, just positioning himself within the edge of it, his presence quiet but intentional. And Marcus reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, the motion smooth, unhurried, drawing no sudden attention, just enough to be noticed, and he removed a folded document, not thick, not dramatic, just a single sheet, and held it lightly between his fingers before placing it on the table, not sliding it, not presenting it as evidence, simply setting it down as if it belonged there all along. And the paper rested beside Richard's glass, catching the light from above, the printed lines visible but not yet read, and Marcus withdrew his hand, returning it to his side without gesture, without emphasis, and the room seemed to lean in, not physically, but in awareness, as if every small sound had lowered just enough to allow the moment to settle fully. And Richard looked at the paper, not touching it yet, his gaze fixed, calculating, weighing whether acknowledging it would grant it significance. And that hesitation alone marked the shift more clearly than anything spoken, because, for the first time since he had entered the room, he was not leading the moment, he was responding to it. And Marcus remained still, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, not watching Richard with urgency, not waiting with expectation, just present, allowing the truth to arrive at its own pace, knowing it already had. Richard did not reach for the paper immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, carried more weight than any reaction he could have given, his eyes fixed on the document, as if it might change if he waited long enough, as if ignoring it could return the moment to something more familiar. But the room did not shift back. It stayed exactly where it was, quiet in a way that was not empty but attentive. And Marcus did not move, did not urge, did not explain. He simply allowed the silence to do what it was already doing, pressing gently but steadily against the edges of certainty. And finally Richard's hand moved, slow, controlled, his fingers resting on the edge of the paper before lifting it just enough to bring it into clearer view. The motion deliberate, careful, as if the weight of it had already been felt before it was understood, and his eyes scanned the top line first, then the second, then stopped. Not because he had finished reading, but because something in the wording had interrupted the rhythm of his expectations, and for a brief second, his expression did not change, not outwardly, but something behind it shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like a calculation being revised mid-thought. And he continued reading, slower now. Each line no longer glanced over but examined. The confidence in his posture adjusting in increments so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. But the room was paying attention now, even if no one looked directly. Even if conversations resumed in quieter tones, the awareness remained, focused, waiting, and Richard lowered the paper slightly, his eyes lifting back to Marcus, searching again, but this time not for a reaction, not for weakness, but for confirmation, and Marcus met his gaze the same way he had all night, steady, composed, offering nothing beyond presence itself, and that was enough, more than enough, because the absence of denial, the absence of performance, left no space for reinterpretation, and Richard's fingers tightened slightly against the document before relaxing again, his breath shifting, almost imperceptibly deeper, as if the room had become smaller without physically changing, and one of his guests leaned back in their chair, not speaking, not interrupting, but creating space, instinctively understanding that whatever was unfolding did not belong to them anymore. And behind Marcus, Daniel stood still, his posture straight. His expression settled into something that resembled quiet certainty, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, just present as a witness to what had already become clear. And Richard looked back down at the paper once more, this time not scanning, not searching, just confirming. And when he lowered it again, the confidence that had filled his voice earlier was no longer as effortless. It had not disappeared, but it had changed, refined into something more careful, more aware. "You are saying," he began, his tone measured, slower than before, "that this is already done." And the question was not really a question. It was a realization forming itself into words, and Marcus inclined his head once. A simple acknowledgment, not adding to it, not softening it, just letting it stand, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with the quiet sound of understanding settling into place. And for the first time that evening, Richard did not immediately speak again. He sat there, the paper still in his hand, the room no longer bending around him, but existing independently of his expectations, and that shift, subtle as it was, marked the moment everything had already changed. Richard lowered the paper slowly, not with the sharp motion of dismissal, but with the careful control of someone recalibrating in real time. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze shifting briefly to the edge of the table, then to the glass in front of him, then back to Marcus, as if searching for a version of the moment that still placed him in control. But that version no longer existed, not in the room, not in the way the air had settled, not in the way the silence now held weight. Instead of expectation, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, not weaker, but different, less certain, more deliberate. "Why?" he asked. And the question was not framed as a challenge, not shaped by authority. It was quieter, almost personal, as if he was trying to understand something that extended beyond the document in his hand. And Marcus regarded him for a brief second before answering, his expression unchanged, his posture steady. "Because it mattered," he said, and the simplicity of the answer did not reduce the moment, it deepened it, because it did not defend, it did not justify, it simply stated. And Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the tension shifting from outward control to inward recognition, and one of his guests adjusted their seat again, this time not out of discomfort, but out of awareness that the dynamic at the table had already transformed into something they were only observing, not part of. And Richard glanced at the paper once more before setting it down carefully beside his plate, aligning it unconsciously with the edge of the table, a gesture of order in a moment that had lost its structure. And then he looked up again, meeting Marcus's gaze directly, not with the same dominance as before, but with something closer to acknowledgment. "I misjudged you," he said, the words measured, not rushed, not softened, just placed where they belonged, and the admission did not echo loudly. It did not demand attention, but it carried a quiet gravity that the room felt immediately, because it was not common, not from someone like him. And Marcus did not react with satisfaction, did not shift his stance, did not take a step forward. He simply listened, allowing the words to exist without amplifying them. And Richard continued after a brief pause, his tone steady but reflective. "I saw a role," he said, "and assumed it was the whole story." And he let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgment of his own limitation, and the chandelier light above caught the edge of his glass as his fingers rested beside it, no longer gripping, no longer asserting, just present. And Marcus inclined his head slightly, not as submission, not as acceptance, but as recognition. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, grounded, unchanged by the shift in tone. "That happens often," he said, and the words carried no accusation, no edge, just truth. And Richard nodded once, a small, contained movement, his gaze dropping briefly before returning again. "It should not," he replied, and the statement settled into the space between them, not as a correction, but as a realization. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but steady, reflective, as if the room itself had exhaled. And in the background, the soft rhythm of the restaurant resumed, not as distraction, but as continuation, plates moving, glasses lifted, quiet conversations returning to their natural flow. And Marcus reached toward the table, not to reclaim the document, not to emphasize the moment, but to adjust a misplaced napkin slightly, aligning it with the rest of the setting, a small, precise motion that restored order without drawing attention. And when he stepped back, his posture remained the same, composed, balanced, unaffected by the shift in power, because for him, it had never been about that. And Richard watched that movement, that quiet restoration, and understood something he had not before, something that did not need to be said aloud, because it was already clear in the way Marcus carried himself, in the way he had handled the entire moment. Without raising his voice, without stepping outside himself, and Richard gave a final, almost imperceptible nod, not as agreement, not as surrender, but as acknowledgment, and the room, for the first time that evening, felt fully settled. The moment did not end with applause or raised voices or any visible shift that would signal closure. It ended the way truth often does, quietly, settling into place without asking for attention, and Marcus stepped back from the table with the same calm precision he had carried from the beginning, his movements measured, unhurried, not as someone leaving a confrontation, but as someone completing a task. And the room did not freeze this time. It flowed, but differently, softer, more aware, as if something unspoken had passed through it and left everything just slightly altered. And Richard remained seated for a second longer than necessary, his hand resting near the edge of the document, not touching it now, just close enough to acknowledge its presence. And then he reached for his glass, lifting it slowly, not as a gesture of dominance, but as something more reflective, more grounded, his posture no longer leaning outward to control the space, but settling inward, contained. And one of his guests leaned toward him slightly, speaking in a lower tone that did not carry, not because it needed to be hidden, but because the room itself had adjusted to quieter truths. And Richard nodded once, a small, deliberate movement, before setting the glass back down with care, aligning it without thinking, mirroring a gesture he had just witnessed. And across the room, Daniel moved again, but not with urgency, not with tension, his steps even, his expression composed, no longer reacting, only maintaining, because the balance had already been restored in a way that did not require intervention. And Marcus walked past the tables, not drawing attention, not avoiding it, simply present, and a few guests glanced at him as he passed, their expressions neutral but thoughtful, as if they had seen something they could not fully explain but would remember later. And when he reached the far end of the dining room, he paused briefly near the window, where the city lights reflected faintly against the glass, soft and distant, and he adjusted the cuff of his jacket once, a small, habitual motion, before continuing toward the service corridor, not retreating, not hiding, just moving through the space he now carried differently. And behind him, the restaurant continued, plates arriving, conversations resuming, the quiet rhythm of an evening settling into its natural pace. But the tone had changed, subtly, permanently, and back at the table, Richard looked once more at the place where Marcus had stood, not with frustration, not with pride, but with recognition, and he exhaled slowly. The kind of breath that follows understanding rather than control, and he reached for the document again, not to question it, not to challenge it, but to accept its presence fully, placing it neatly beside his plate before turning his attention back to his guests, his voice lower now, steadier, not commanding, but participating, and the difference, though small, was real, and in the quiet reflection of the window at the edge of the room. Marcus's silhouette passed for just a second before disappearing into the corridor, leaving behind no announcement, no declaration, only the steady presence of something that had already proven itself without needing to be seen. And in that absence, the room held its shape, balanced, quiet, and complete.